I did. I went to one of those. Well, now this is recorded. I was at a wedding for. Actually, this was awkward to begin with. It was an ex-girlfriend, and I was in the wedding. So I don't know. It was
Wait,
weird.
was she the one getting married?
Yeah, she was. She was getting married to the guy, and well, I mean, we were friends and stuff. But yeah, isn't that weird though to be in the wedding? Yeah, whatever. But it was a Catholic wedding, and I'm not Catholic, so you're not supposed to go up for communion. You're supposed to go up for the blessing. But I went up. Just seemed fine. I mean, I didn't really know what to do at the last moment. They were like, how do you like give them the signal that it's like blessing time? Because everybody else seemed to be Catholic. So you seem to know a lot about this stuff. I just went grabbing for the cup.
How was it? In high school, was a Eucharistic minister.
Oh, you got one of those online things?
No, it was through my high school.
What?
We had all school masses, and they needed people to do it. So I was like, sure. So
Oh, you went to it?
I got to skip a day of school.
Was this a Catholic? Was this a Catholic school?
Yeah.
Oh, so you do know? You do the crisscross thing.
Yeah. And then it's supposed to be if you're a Christian and you just want a blessing, you do your left over your right. But if you're not Christian, you do right over left.
Wow.
Yeah. It was like a day's worth of study. Like, I thought it'd be pretty easy, Just like, here you go. Oh.
It seems like they need to have like cards you bring up there with you. You just kind of.
Red card, green card, yellow card.
All right, so where did we leave off on this thing? What was the last thing we did? I remember talking about MVC. I think I probably mentioned the word singleton.
Yeah, we have a slide for singleton.
Okay. Yeah, when my wife and I first joined our church, she didn't want to have, she had never drank alcohol, so she didn't want the alcohol. So the pastor would have like a special section in the middle of the little plate thing, where they would fill the cup, I think, with the wine, then dump it out, then fill it with grape juice after that. But now she just goes for the pure stuff because she's gonna live with me, so she's basically an alcoholic now, I guess. Let's see what this class, right? Okay, so last time we talked about a couple of different design patterns. What is a design pattern? If you were this funky name, what would you say that guy is? Go ahead.
It's a proposed good solution to a common problem.
Okay, so in life we have all sorts of different problems we want to solve. Same thing with computer programming, computer science. Dr. Locklear's little mantra, computer science is problem solving. Yeah, I mean, we're just applying this tool, technology, to the same problem solving you do in normal life. So within that, it's common for us to say, oh, well, here's a collection of common problems. So for instance, in real life, if you want to get ice cream out of the little container, you go to the drawer, and if you have one available, you get the ice cream scoop, right? That gives you the right kind of leverage that's the right tool for the job, or one of the right tools for the job. Or you can kind of take it out like toothpaste, and you get a big serving of ice cream, but just kind of squeeze it out so it just kind of plops into the. I usually do it in one of those giant salad mixer bowls, and just eat the ice cream right out of there. But so we've decided to come up with fancy names for this to get research stuff. All right, so one of those fancy names is MVC, Model View Controller, and this dictates that, it makes sense for us to design our interface here, write our code over here, and then if you have data, a database or something like that, write that over here. Keep those things separate from each other, okay? And we've actually started doing that a little bit, where for us, the model would be like our player object, So if we go back in here, let's see, did we create a player object yet? Oh, in our Java version of our team manager thing, we had a player object, right? So we have our main method. We're going to call that guy our controller. Okay, so the thing that we call driver, that would be our controller that kind of runs the logic of the program. We worked with these data objects. One of them was called player, so that would be our model. Player would be a model. And then when we were using Eclipse, our interface was the stupid text interface. Here, our interface is our layout file. Okay, so MVC says keep those things separate and then glue them together in some interesting way. Now, MVC is not an implementation, it's an idea. So every platform you work with is going to have their own version of how MVC is implemented. With Android, the way MVC is implemented is we have our interface out here. We name our widgets with a name. So this widget here, actually I think we did it for this text box, right? Shrink this guy down. So this guy is called input ET. So we gave it a common name out here that we could reference. All right, this is our interface. And then over here in the code, we referenced that name that we gave it in order to give ourselves access in the program to that edit text box. Make sense? All right, so that's the idea of MVC with Android and how it implements it. iOS with Xcode uses things called IB outlets to link those two things together. So instead of doing it in code like this, you actually, on this side of things, you would click on your controller, you would see a list of all outlets, and then you would drag a line from the outlet for your input box to this guy. So we actually hook it up on this side of things, but it's just the same thing, right? You know, we are connecting code to our widgets in either case. Okay, so let's see. So right now, did I already launch this guy? So we say enter something, then we have our click me button working, and I can change that and keep clicking my click me button, and you know, every single time the click me button gets clicked, an event occurs. A on-click event associated with that button occurs. And we've associated a method with that button, right? So over here, for this button, he has an on-click property right here. And we were just talking about see, it still says main activity there and it works. We're going to call that 50-50, whether or not this works.
The drop down wasn't working for me during the hackathon.
Yeah, and it did work for us during the hackathon. So you need to be careful about this drop-down thing because it does give you the choice of what things are in there, but it seems to not always work. The fix will be, if it doesn't work, just take that parenthesis stuff off the end of it. Then it'll work.
See, I would have to write it in, and then it would autofill the main activity thing for me.
And then it would work?
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to suggest you get a 20-sided die. Whenever it doesn't work, roll that, and depending on which option comes up, then you change it that way. And just keep doing that until it works. So that's... Yeah, see, now, on one hand, it's nice that they've tried to automate this, because before you always had to paste it in there, but it also always worked. Before. Now they've tried to automate. They try to go and look at your code and see what functions you've created that are actions, event handlers for this, and then they give you the list here so you can just click on one. Like, oh, I don't have to spell it right now. Great. Except it doesn't always work.
Do you know why it was like during the hackathon for us, like it was showing the admin one? Because I know you restarted Android and it still is doing that instead of the user.
Oh, I did. You remember we looked in here and there's a context, this context thing here?
Oh, yeah.
Because we copied our XML. That's one thing you do need to be careful of a little bit, because if you have, during the hackathon, we wrote an Android app for Grace. And we had several screens that were very similar to each other. So kind of the quickest way of designing those interfaces for those screens would be come in here, grab this entire layout, and just paste it in there to replace the other layout. Well, this layout is associated with the main activity interface. Now, in Android, though, that's only a loose association. It's not like a deal breaker if you have that, but there's some quirkiness that occurs, like it shows you drop downs related to what's in a different class and that kind of stuff. So something to be careful of. I guess the safer thing we should have done is just copy the linear layout part of this. The contents of the sandwich, if you will, and bring that over. But little quirky things that, over time you'll kind of figure out what's the way to pull this stuff off. But in any case, here is our method that we wrote, and this guy was intended to be the event handler for that button click. And event handlers in Android need to follow this format, so it's got to be public, it's got to be void. You can name it whatever you want. Typically, you'll have some description of what event you're handling here. So whether it's on clicked, that's actually just really weird wording, but that's the way it went down. Usually, I would have called this button. Oh no, I called it button clicked. Usually, I would call it something button. I don't even know what I'm talking about now. Usually, I would do something like that, maybe. Which I thought clicked was a really funny thing to say, but fine. Name it whatever you want, but try to make it a descriptive name. This guy is the event for handling something. All right, so realistically for us, if we had a whole bunch of buttons that we were having responses to, you could use the same event for multiple buttons if you wanted to. But let's say we had 3 different buttons, button 1, button 2, button 3. We might write 3 different methods. Button 1 clicked, button 2 clicked, button 3 clicked. Okay, so you would want to name those guys a name that you could recognize as this is the event handler for this particular button. Does that make sense? That way you can connect those two. All right, and that function always takes in a generic view as a parameter. It doesn't have to be named V, but it does need to be a view. That view, when this guy gets called, will be whichever widget called it. So for us, right now, we've only done this with buttons. It'll always be a button that gets passed in. Now, the reason it comes in as a generic view is handlers all follow the same syntax. And everything we see on the screen is a view. I think last time I saw a little bit of an inheritance model. Okay, so we have human athlete soccer players. So we started talking about inheritance a little bit, and we introduced this keyword super. All right, and super is how an instance of a class refers to its parent. So if we look at this in the Android world, there might be a couple of additional degrees of separation here. But as an example, a button is a view. An edit text is a view, so on and so forth. All right, there's actually probably a layer in here where an edit text is actually something that is a editable or something like that, which is a view. So there might be 3 different levels of, maybe this guy is clickable or something like that.
I know that. Alexa told me that.
Told you which part?
That part.
Oh, the inheritance model? Okay, yeah, so all these things that we're used to working with, buttons and edit texts and all those guys, at the end of the day, at their most generic level, they are views. So for us, we can think of anything we see on the screen is a view. All right, so when we're writing our event handler here, this guy will receive whatever view called this guy. It will come in as a generic view, just as find view by ID returns a generic view. And then we have turned it into the specific kind of view that we know it is. We know that title TV is actually a text view. We know that. Even though when we call find view ID, it's going to boil down to the generic view that is that guy. Make sense? All right, so Android handles things as generic views, and then the stuff just kind of happens. You going to be a Bible study, or just for the
Probably no.
just the second class?
Yeah.
All right.
The second class. Because it's the wedding at 11:30.
I got you. Okay, so let's go back here. So we name our event handler here, and then we associate it with that button over here. Here's our button. Here's the on-click event in there for it if we wanted to write it in XML. Otherwise, we can look at design mode, and we can go down to the on-click event in here and select that guy, and then hope it works type thing. In iOS, that same thing is accomplished through something called an IB action. So in iOS, we have two different animals that for accomplishing connecting things to our interface. We have IB outlets, which is how we give ourselves programmatic access to a variable, and we have IB actions, which is how we give ourselves associative events with buttons and things like that. All right, so in iOS, we would write an IB action. The IB action would then show up in our list over here, and we would drag that guy with a line over here to the button and choose the event it's responding to. All right. Sometimes it's more convenient on the Android side to do some of this. Other times it's more convenient on the iOS side. So, but what we're seeing here is there's two different implementations to MVC, and they're similar to each other because they're accomplishing similar tasks, but they're not identical. Okay, so MVC is an idea, and then its implementation will be different in different settings. All right. All right. So. Now, I think I had mentioned that I was going to show you a way to get to this, like a second screen from this button and pass some information. And in the tutorial you had worked through, the way you got information from screen A to screen B was through put extras, right? And then when you got to that, you were able to grab the intent and extract the extra from it. I'm going to show you how to do this through something called a singleton. All right. So for starters, let's go ahead and instead of this click me button, well, why don't we just add a second button? That'll make more sense. So we'll go up here, we'll grab a button, we'll drag it down here, and we'll call, oh. Come on, you can do it. Maybe you can't. Next screen. All right, so we'll name that guy next screen. Now we're going to go ahead and write an event handler to get us to that next screen. So that guy's just going to be public void, name it whatever you want. It's going to take in a view as a parameter. All right, so we'll go over here to our code, the interface, and we'll say public void next page button clicked. This guy will take a view as a parameter. And we'll put some logic in here, and what this guy's going to ultimately do is it's going to create an intent for a new activity and then launch that activity. That's what the logic in there is ultimately going to do. All right. But right now, let's just go ahead and let's connect that. All right. So we know the name of it, and I'm going to go ahead and copy it just in case we're going to need that. We'll go back over here to the interface side of things. Here's the on click for this guy. And now we have our next page button clicked. So I'll select that guy and we'll cross our fingers and hope that that actually works. All right. And now if we want to make sure that the thing is got accurately connected, I'm going to go ahead and do this. Let's just write some placeholder code in here real quick. And we can just actually go ahead and use our text view as output just to make sure we got this working. So we'll set the text in here to next page button clicked, just so we know that that event is getting called. All right. Give us some confidence that the two are hooked up correctly, especially given that Android is a little funky right now. When was the last time you opened the Android Studio and there wasn't an update? There's like an update every single time, it seems like, to something. Yep, so that's the crash version of it. All right, so when that happens, we'll go in here.
You can kind of tell because, so in your Java,
Yep.
the method, like headers, the name of the method is gray. As opposed to, see, now it's black.
Oh, well, this one's still gray.
I don't think that button would work.
But it does.
It does now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, wait, well.
Since we put that method in, I don't know if it will.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Well, let's find out.
Yeah, I was like trying to figure out why my buttons weren't working, and Jonah came over and he looked at my job
Yeah.
and he was like,
Yeah, that one doesn't work now.
Yeah.
That's weird.
But I think now, even if you just reset what the button did in the dropdown, I think it'll work. That.
Oh, because I added
Yeah.
another one and
Yeah.
it changed the
Yeah.
drop downs. It
Yeah.
like she must have changed the IDs of those guys. Oh, that's stupid. All right. Well, in any case, this button now works. The next page button clicked. We've proven to ourselves we're getting into that code because we just set the text. Let's fix this guy here real quick. And my feeling is that this will be a permanent fix if you just backspace through this stuff. Then you don't have to worry about the stuff updating. This is the way it used to work. You would just come in here and if this was just a text box, you would just paste in the name of the method as opposed to having a drop down. Seems to me that's maybe the safe way of doing things right now instead of using the drop down. All right, so we know that this guy is giving us our, it's associated with that click event. So now we just need to write the necessary code to get us to a second screen. Well, in order for us to have a second screen, we need to have a second activity. So for us, we want to think about every screen in our application is an activity. Okay, so we're going to come in here to our Java. We're going to right click. We're going to say new. We're going to go to an activity. Now, notice that we have several different activities. Well, here, I gotta do this more better. Most bestest, actually. So we have several different activities we can choose from. I almost always just use an empty activity and then flesh it out to the way I want it to be. That isn't to say you might have some time-saving ability otherwise. So for instance, if you're going to do something that has scrolls or tabs, you can have it go ahead and build in some of the interface for you. But I almost always start with an empty activity. All right, and let's call this guy screen 2. Okay, and it's going to give us a layout name automatically of activity screen 2. It almost shows us the full package name there. Very nice. All right, so we named it screen 2. The rest of it we can just leave it out, leave the way it's defaulted. Make sure the generate layout file is created. What this does is it associates. Remember we looked earlier and it had in the XML it showed us that the context of this layout was associated with screen 2. That's what this thing does. When we generate a layout file here for it, it marries this XML to this screen 2 so that those things are, get associated. And the first activity we created was by default a launcher activity. We can only have one launcher activity. That's the activity that when your app starts, that's the guy that it begins with. When you click this, what it does is it updates a file called your Android manifest. The Android manifest file is kind of your global configuration file for your Android application. We don't want to have to go in there and edit that thing by hand very often. Sometimes we have to, especially when we add some third-party stuff in here and that kind of crap. But in general, whenever we do things like this, we choose launcher activity, it will go and make those changes for us and adjust which screen launches our application. Okay? So for us, this guy's just going to be a standard activity. And it needs to be the backwards compatibility one so that it works on older devices. But standard activity, it's not our launcher one because we intend to get to this activity from another screen. So we'll just leave the rest alone. Click on Finish. So there's our Screen 2 activity. And then let's go ahead and go to our layout for Screen 2. And we'll just drag a text view out here. Actually, just so I don't have issues later, I'll go ahead and do my vertical linear layout in here. I'll stretch it to the whole screen. Now notice if I go to the text version of this, notice the context of this guy is Screen 2. That's what occurred when I said associate a layout file with this. It wrote that text in there for me. So we don't have to worry about it. That's just evidence that that occurred. Okay. So I have my linear layout. That way I can drop stuff in and it just stacks on top of each other. It makes my life easier. Because I suck at interfaces. Yeah, she made half the interfaces in our code and they looked way better than mine. It was just, mine are just garbage. So we'll just put a text view out here. We'll call this guy Screen 2. I like how it just says, look, you don't have room for all this. Except, so we'll say Screen 2 there. I think if you set the text alignment there to center, I'm interested in this. So I just set the text alignment to center. I want to know if it adjusted the gravity or if it actually accomplished that someplace, some other way. Because previously I had shown you that the way you do all that stuff is through gravity, right? So I'm interested if this is a shortcut for gravity. Let's go and look real quick. See if I can remember where G is in my alphabet. No, doesn't set it. So I must do it a different way. So there must be a text align. Yep, there's a text alignment property of a text view, which seems to act just like gravity, but there is a text alignment. So you can do that without doing gravity if you want. And then you can make the text larger as well. Probably not a big deal for us right now. I think it's like text size maybe. Yep, text size. Do drop down, so we'll make that guy, yeah, now I can read it. All right, so this is our Screen 2 activity. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to have our main activity, when we click that button, launch Screen 2. Okay, now the way that's accomplished, we'll go back to our main activity, and we're doing that logic right here. So instead of setting that text view, we're going to launch a new activity. So to launch a new activity, we need something called an intent. We intend to do something. All right, so we're going to create an intent. I is equal to a new intent. And when we create, when you create an intent, you have to give it the context in which the intent is going to exist. And there's actually a couple versions. Let me see if I can show you the intent options here. Does it give it the pop down? Nope. Well, apparently I can't make it show up long enough. Here, let me do this then. Oh, it's already open. Okay, so let's do Android intent. Should get us to the documentation for an intent. Yeah, if you remember earlier, I mentioned something about, I think I mentioned it about, why am I missing the fragments? Did I mention the word fragments last time? I like to make everything a separate activity initially, but we have these things called fragments, which you can embed inside of another activity, and it's kind of more an advanced feature set of like you want a certain part of a screen to have its own controller behind the scenes. Those are called fragments. Think of them like mini activities. All right, and that guy then has its own control, its own interface controller that handles the logic for that guy, and you could actually embed those through your XML, through the design. But I like to do the things programmatically, so we'll skip past that, but that popped up in my mind here as we were flipping through there. So rather than creating all this intent crap, you can all right. Where's my intent constructors? Well, I guess maybe this guy will show us it. Or yeah, here. This is what I'm looking for. All right, so you can create an empty intent. Well, that's not going to intend to do anything specific, so we're not going to use that one. We can build an intent in terms of an existing intent. Also not going to do that one. We can give it a string, so there's a special format for a string that we can give it that kind of describes all the stuff we want this intent to do. We're not going to use that one. So this guy, this is to launch an external application. Like if you wanted to create an intent that like launched like the phone application or something like that, you would give it a URI, which is like a local URL to launch another activity. This is the one we're going to use. Okay, so this guy right down here, this is taking in a context. Now we've used that word context. I always think that this word is a little bit confusing when I don't know, it's used in different programming technologies and stuff like that. But we've mentioned context in here when we're in as it relates to scope, right? If we're in a static method versus a non-static method, if we're in a static method, the context inside of that method is a static context. Therefore, it's owned by the class, and any function calls we write are assumed to have the class name in front of it. Okay? I've taught you to always be explicit. If you're calling a class method, you'll use the name of the class, followed by a dot, followed by the method that you're going to call. If you're calling an instance method, you'll say this dot, or if it's an instance method inside of this particular class, or an instance of the class, if it's like s.charat, you'll use the actual instance to call that method, because that's never incorrect. If you always use the class name to call class methods, and you always use the instance name to call instance methods, it'll never be wrong. Okay? Even though sometimes you're allowed to omit that if you're in a certain context. Okay? So context kind of describes the environment in which we're living. For us, this context is out of what context is this intent occurring? So we give it the current context, because in this case we're going to use the current context to launch a new context. Our current context here is an activity. An activity is a context. All right, so if we go through the whole hierarchy of what an activity is, somewhere in there it's a context. All right, so a context has a this guy's not clickable, but it would be in the. Oh, actually, he might be. Nope, he's not there either. But this guy is a class that defines things that contexts can do. And it's going to be some simplified list of things that only context can do, and activity is one of those. So we're going to give it the context we're coming from. For us, it's just going to be this. The context is this activity. And then the class description of the class we want this intent to actually launch. All right? So we're going to do that here. We're going to say new intent from this context. And the activity we want to launch is screen2.class. All right? So we wanted to build a brand new activity from the screen2 class. We intend to launch it from this particular context. And then we want to say this dot start activity. Now notice we can start activities with different different settings. We're just going to use this top one as the starter, but we can actually start an activity from for a response. So when an activity is done, it can actually spit back an answer to us if we wanted it to do that. I kind of teach this to use singletons, but if I'm going to tell you those two, if we kind of drew the picture of that, I'll talk about singletons a little bit more here in a second. But what you can do is we have our first activity, and this guy is going to launch a second activity. Let's do this. If we want to keep everything self-contained, this first activity can pass information to that second activity through extras. All right, and we do that through our intent. So we would say I dot put extra, and so we can have extras of all sorts of different types. So I'm going to say name is Mike. Actually, yep, like that. So what I've done there is I've associated a variable value, a name value pair with that launcher, that intent, called name. The variable is called name, and its value is Mike. All right. Now what I can do then is over on, let me just delete this for a second. On the screen 2 side, I can say this dot, what is it, get intent? That's the intent that this guy came with. And then I can say get extra. I think it's called get string extra. Name. And I can say string name is equal to that. And that guy will be Mike. That's the value that'll come out of that. All right, I packaged it up with the intent, and when the first activity launches the second activity, that intent is in tow. Make sense? So that's a way for me to directly get information from one activity to a second activity. All right, so this is our, what's that, main activity. And this is screen 2 in our world. Now, optionally, we can have an activity spit something back. When this activity ultimately ends, okay, when it exits, we can exit with a response instead of just exiting. And with that, we can actually package extras too, but basically we are sending, well, let's just call it response. All right, so we can send information back to whoever called me. All right, maybe you let it know whether it successfully happened. Maybe this page is a registration page, for example, and you're supposed to register a new user there. Well, if I hit cancel, registration didn't actually occur. Well, so you might want to respond back to this guy letting him know that registration didn't occur. If registration did occur and it was successful, you might want to respond back letting it know that, yeah, everything went to plan over there. So if you need to react differently, go ahead. But you can do everything self-contained like this. Now, this makes sense in an application that is relatively small, where we want to keep the little ecosystem between these two activities kind of self-contained. We don't want that information leaking out to, confuse the issue. Now, the approach I like to take, let's call it 75% of the time. This will be my 25% of the time. If I just need to get one piece of information to one additional activity, this is one way you can do it, even though it's not necessarily the most convenient way to do it, in my opinion. All right, so I'm going to copy this slide. So what I would do is I'm going to create a class up here. Make this guy a different color. And this is actually our singleton. This guy would go ahead and set a variable in that singleton. This guy would just read that variable from that singleton. We could also store the response up there if we wanted to. So this guy would be able to read from that response. This guy would be able to send that response. This is a global object that is accessible to all activities. Now, in this case, where we just have two screens, it's kind of a tie goes to the runner type situation where it's like, well, you can just use extras and it's just as good as using a singleton. Singletons, in my opinion, are more convenient, but that doesn't mean always use them. Because one thing you can have happen is in a, and let me actually show you by an example. In a large application, so I'm going to show you an application for one of my clients here. And I'll show you the singleton we have in here. So, you know, there's lots of source code files in this guy, and we have a file in here called iplur core. So this is the singleton for this guy. Well, here, let me just launch it inside of here. So it's hide this, hide this. So here's a singleton, and look how much crap is in there. So at some point, it does get down to the point of this guy becoming a little bit unwieldy. Does that make sense? Now, nothing says you can't have multiple singletons in an application. If you have 3 screens that are all sharing some information, you can create a single singleton, name it something convenient that kind of links it to those 3 screens, and then have those 3 screens share information just through that one singleton, instead of having one global singleton for your entire application that just has everything under the sun packed into it. It's like, oh, well, I need this information to go from this screen to this screen. Well, let's just throw it in the singleton. And you do that enough times, all of a sudden you run into a situation like this where you just have a zillion things up on the singleton and you're not even sure what the heck is what. You end up having to go back and trace your route. Now, in this case, it ended up being we were so far down the path that we just, when in doubt, it's probably in the singleton type thing. All right, but just to give you an idea that those things exist in real life, I guess. All right, so we're going to go ahead and write our own singleton for getting information from screen 1 to screen 2. And singletons are pretty easy. They sound scarier than they are. I'm going to go ahead and right-click. We're going to say a new Java class. Notice there's actually a thing where you can make a singleton here. I don't like the way they make their singletons. I'll show you what it looks like here. So I'm going to call this guy, we'll call it core2 because I'm going to name mine core just in case it conflicts or something. So it creates this thing that looks like this that gives us a, creates an instance of this singleton, and then we can grab the instance from our singleton. So we would have to say core2.getInstance dot, and then you would list the value you wanted. I think that's dumb. So that's way more work than you have to do for this. Just inconvenient to use it. So I'm going to delete that guy. And I'm going to create my own singleton. So it's going to be a Java class. And I usually like naming singletons something like core or something like that. You know, it's like a core place to store everything. Name it whatever you want. I'll hit OK. And this guy is going to have a whole bunch of static crap in it. Okay. So we're going to say static, lowercase in this language, string name. That's it. Okay, so in our singleton, in our little variable environment, if you will, in the cloud, we've gone ahead and we've given it one variable called name that doesn't have a value yet. What we're going to do is we're going to set that value from our first screen, and we're going to read that value from our second screen. Okay, so I'll go ahead here on main activity. So rather than putting this extra in here, so here I'll just comment this out. So the alternative to that is core2 or core.name is equal to Mike. Done. It's set. All right. Now I'm going to use this particular activity to launch this new intent. So I'll say this dot start activity I. All right. So I create the intent, then I use the intent to start a new activity. That will get me to screen 2. Very first thing that happens on screen 2 is the onCreate method gets called. Rather than getting the name that way, we'll say string name is equal to core.name. So he just read from our singleton. So singleton is a single class that lives up there. There's not multiple instances of it. Everything in there is static. It's owned by the class, so it's core dot, in this case, the field name, which is name. Okay? And that'll get me the value for that guy. And just for the sake of argument, let's go ahead to our screen 2 here. That guy currently says screen 2 on it. So let's just have it show that we can get to screen 2 for starters. So let's just launch this guy. And then we'll actually prove that we received that information. Oh, I forgot it doesn't pop up anymore. So I'll go to next screen. Here's my screen 2. So we have a second screen in our application. One interesting difference between iOS programming and Android programming is a consistent thing in Android devices is they come with a back button. Android implements their applications a little bit different than iOS does. In iOS, you have the application global interface, and inside that lives a whole bunch of view controllers. View controllers are synonymous with activities. They mean the same thing from our perspective, okay? Each one's a screen in their application. Well, if we want the second view controller in iOS to be able to get back to the previous one, we have to build in our own back button, that says go back to the previous guy. Well, Android comes with a back button. So the Android operating system itself maintains a stack of all the activities that are currently running on your device. So when I hit back, it goes to the previous activity that was on the stack. That might be the previous activity within the current application you are. That might go back to your home screen. If you launch this activity off your home screen, it might go back to another activity that used a URI to launch your activity. So it's going to go back to the previous activity. So that's what that guy does. He's built in, so we didn't have to write the code for that. It's built in. Now, having said that, we can give ourselves a back button if we want our back button to do something other than the generic, or if we wanted to interject something in there. So for instance, when we hit the back button, maybe we want to go ahead and go in there and make something occur. Maybe set something in core that, the registration happened or registration didn't happen. Similarly, we might also want an activity to naturally end, getting us back to the previous screen, because if this guy was a registration screen, you don't want to have to go through, put your username, password, all that crap in, hit save, it pops up saying user successfully created, and then all of a sudden you also then have to hit back. A little bit unintuitive. You'd rather it pop up for a second saying success, and then go ahead and automatically go back to the previous screen for you. Make sense? So those are some differences between iOS and Android, is that built-in back button in Android, which I would say more times than not, that's helpful, the back button. One thing you run into with iOS applications is there's kind of a common pattern in iOS applications called the navigation bar, where as you go through stuff, you basically have a next and back button at the top. Well, let's say you're going to use a navigation bar not just to go from screen to screen to screen, but you actually want to give feature abilities up there. Well, you only get 2 buttons in a navigation bar. And on iOS, you have to basically use one of them for your back button. Or that's where it kind of makes the most sense. When you're on an iPhone and you're looking for, the back button, you usually look upper left, right? That's kind of where it lives typically. So one of your 2 buttons is already taken, because it's an iOS application rather than an Android application. All right. So I think I'd asked this before, but just as a reminder, how many of you are Android users versus iOS users? Who uses Android in here? Okay. Who uses iOS? That's pretty much a half and half. Anybody use other, like a Windows phone? BlackBerry? Abacus? Android users, how many of you would never use an iPhone? Okay. iPhone users, how many of you would never use an Android device?
This is my first iPhone.
No. Isn't that funny how iPhone users try to act like they're not the Apple superior people? It's like, oh, the reason I didn't answer is because I don't recognize their existence. Why wouldn't you ever use an Apple device or iPhone device?
For me, like, they're more expensive.
Are they really? I guess okay. I could see that, and I guess this is an elitist view. I always get whatever the best phone is. So if I were getting an Android device, I would get the top tier phone, which is the same price point as Apple's. Oh yeah.
I have the Note 5, which is Samsung's top tier.
Yeah, when it came out, right?
$200 and I can get a new phone after a year.
Well, isn't that pretty much Apple has the same thing where you pay $199 for, their device, and then in a year depending on which next plan or something you sign up for. Just seems like for the top tier phones, it's similar. I mean, you might have different deals from different providers. What Android really gives you is they give you so many more devices to choose from. So you can look at a device and say, okay, well, here's the device that has Samsung's name on it. That's super expensive. It's basically the iPhone price equivalent. And then here's an HTC or something like that really has all the features of this guy or pretty close, and it's free, with my cell plan or something like that. So you just have different options. Okay, but for you, it's price point.
That, and for me, the whole iOS interface, it looks like something that a child would use.
Okay.
It doesn't look like sophisticated or adult-like it looks like.
Okay. You're very limited to, you got to do it the Apple way or their way or the highway.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, for me it's mainly the interface because all my roommates have iPhones, but one of my specific roommates, I think she has an S5 or whatever. And I was looking at hers and you have no control over what apps you want on your actual screens. Whereas for my phone, you can keep it in your little app thing, and then you go click apps and you can see all your apps. For
Okay.
her, she doesn't have that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So there's one level of organization difference. So iPhone, there's no such thing. Well, you actually could do that. You can create a folder that says apps and then throw everything into that folder.
That's just more work.
No, I get it. And then you can on Android, can you further organize into folders inside of your app drawer?
Yes.
Yeah, you can do folders
yeah.
inside the app.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think there are more cooler apps in the Android than the iOS. The free apps and the apps in the Android devices are, I say, better than those in iOS.
Oh, really? See, I would go strongly the other direction.
Let me say games, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
The games in the Android phones are way better than the
Really? Has that been?
That's why
I've noticed there's some where it'll be free on Android, but you have to pay on iOS.
I think part of it might go down to the developer fees between the two.
Developer fees are the same.
I thought it was
The
cheaper.
sign up is
Okay.
cheaper but in terms of what Google takes, let me give it to you from the developer perspective. So I write software for both. If I have an application idea that I want to make money off of, makes way more sense to write that app for iOS than it does for Android. So, when you look at the sheer numbers, there's a higher number of people using Android because there's so many different devices out there. But there's a significantly higher percentage of people on iOS that will pay for an app. So maybe that's an affluence thing or, whatever it is. I also, my experience has been that the average app on iOS, because Apple's review process is pretty kind of Nazi-ish. They'll reject an app just because they think it's a bad idea. Because Apple can just do that. Where in Android, there's not even a review process. I mean, you can have an app live on the App Store 15 seconds later. I mean, you can just take a naked picture of yourself, put it up there, and say this is an app. And until somebody complains, it's an app. So I think your average quality of app on iOS is better, not because of the development necessarily, just because of the steps you have to take in order to get it up on the store. Apple is very stringent about it, but also, I mean, from a money-making perspective, you make way more selling iOS apps than you do Android apps. So I guess from a developer's perspective, it would surprise me if there were better games or better apps on Android than there would be on iOS, because the bigger outfits that are making the higher end games or something like that, they would tend to target iOS first, I would think.
But see, I think with that is they sell the ad space, because a lot of the stuff, even though it's like free or cheaper on Android, there's more ads. So I think they might make more money on ads, so it's not like directly affecting the customer, but they're still getting their money.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah.
I always think of Android uses such much powerful hardware to power the devices, where iOS and Apple they make their own chips, they make the hardware and the software. So like iOS is not to use much powerful chips, and they run much more efficiently than hardware.
Well, you get the. I mean, if you take the newest Apple device, the chips are as powerful with the at the time the newest Android devices. But with Android devices, you have new devices coming out every month and stuff like that. Where with iOS, you're waiting a year for their new stuff. And don't give them too much credit for making their own chips. They make a lot of their own hardware, but really, what Apple does is they acquire companies that make the stuff, and then they put an Apple logo on it, right? Apple says they make their own silicon for their chips. Well, they acquired a company that makes processors, and now that company's called Apple. They wrote a check for that. But I mean, to your point, if you have a high-end Android device, you have, let's say you always buy the highest, the fastest device, or something like that. There's a greater chance you're going to have a higher performance device on Android, because you have lots of opportunities during the year to get that device. Where if 7 months from now, I want to get the newest, latest, greatest iPhone, I'm getting this iPhone, the 7 that came out several months ago. So I'm getting a device that's almost a year old, a 9-month-old device, and clearly stuff has come out during that 9 months on the Android side that has outperformed that, right? So I think that could be truth. I always thought that was interesting. If we take a segue from that, I think just this last week, the PlayStation Pro came out, right? Now, from a developer's perspective, one thing that I find interesting with that is historically, okay, so if you're like a high-end gamer, you might say that, okay, well, PC gaming makes more sense than console gaming, because you could put all sorts of performance into your PC and get more out of the games, let's say. But from a kind of almost an esports kind of example, console gaming means that everybody has the same equipment. So now you're working with your skill. Every machine's going to be the same speed and some of that. So having a PlayStation Pro that has faster processors and a better graphics seems to break that consistency, which is what I kind of felt consoles had going for them. I thought having everybody with the same hardware was a limitation for developers. You got to figure out, how do I squeeze the most stuff into that hardware? But it also made for a consistent gaming experience across all people, especially for esports. But now with the PlayStation Pro, doesn't that kind of break it? I think we're going to start having, as in some of these esport competitions, they're going to have things where you're not allowed, your console must be an original PlayStation 4 or a PlayStation Pro. It'll be there'll be two different categories.
See, I think they did it more so with the PlayStation 4 Pro, but there's always been like some degree, like even the PlayStation 3, they had the PlayStation 3, the Slim, and the Super Slim. Each one, even though they were smaller, they still had better hardware.
Oh, did they?
Yeah. So
okay.
It's been a consistent.
So it has existed.
Yeah, this was obviously a bigger jump than those have been.
Yeah, see, I think I was under the impression, and I don't know for sure, but I was under the impression that when you went to like the PlayStation, the slimmer one, that what they did is they had the same performance hardware that they were able to fit into a smaller space, or had better heat dissipation to make a smaller device. But the machines were the same speed. Sometimes you'd have a bigger hard drive or something like that, but I thought the processors were the same. I could be wrong.
They're a little bit better.
Okay.
It's nowhere near the.
Well,
jump they had
if it's different at all, then that breaks. I mean, that is. I mean, what I'm saying is if you don't have a consistent experience across the board, then all of a sudden, you have more stuff that if you have a better graphics card in a PC game, when you get to a really crowded area, your graphics card is going to keep up, where somebody else might start. They're getting 2 frames a second. They can't even play. Well, that person's going to lose, right? Unless you're playing against me. That is 50-50 maybe. I think it was the game Battlefield that you could carry turrets around. I was playing with one of my students one time, and he wasn't even shooting at me. He would just come and put a turret like at my feet. I couldn't keep up with him. Like, he would just run up to me, put the turret, run away, and I would just die to these turrets. It was embarrassing. Imagine the assignment I gave him the next week. Yeah, so in any case, pretty big segue from this, but the whole idea is that you do have a difference in these devices with the back button, and that is something you take into your problem solving. And I guess I think that it's better on Android with that back button. Every app needs a back button, right? So you might as well build it into the device. So it's kind of a thing, I guess. All right, so what we want to do is we want to go ahead and maybe put the name of the person we received up here on our, where it says screen 2. So we're going to give this guy a name other than text view. So let's call this name TV. All right, then we'll go into screen 2. I could just, well, here. I guess we just need it down here. So let's do text view name TV is equal to the text view version, because it's going to come out as a generic view of this dot find view by ID r.id dot name TV. So again, MVC, we are connecting our controller, the C, to our view, the V, right there. And then we'll say name TV dot set text to our name variable. We could also just set core.name there if we wanted to, if we didn't want to store it inside of a variable. All right, so now that's showing us how we can pass information between the two of them without using the extras. And we're doing all this inside of onCreate, which is the first time we have a chance to interact with the interface associated with screen 2. But this is before that guy shows up on the screen. So all the stuff that's happening in here happens prior to it being on the screen. So we're not going to see it on the screen and then see screen 2 flip to Mike. Does that make sense? So go ahead and run this. Now we know when I click next screen, the first thing it does is it sets the name variable in core to Mike. And then when I get to the second screen, it's going to grab that name variable from core and set it to that text view. Make sense? All right, so that's a singleton. Singleton says it's a good idea to store things that need to be shared among multiple screens. And when I say multiple, the good rule of thumb is more than 2. In this case, we're creating a pretty simple app, so we might as well just take the lazy route and just throw everything up in a singleton. So in that case, it's more of a toss-up, whether you use the extras or the singleton. I almost always use the singleton just because it's so convenient. You don't have to extract stuff. You just put it up there. Whatever you want, just throw it up in the singleton. But do understand that there is a point where you do need to get your brain involved and say, okay, well, there's a lot of logic that I might choose to put up in the singleton, but you know what? It's only being used by these two guys here. Let's keep it self-contained there so we don't make too big of a mess up here. All right? Kind of like at your house, it's easy to just throw stuff out in your garage at your singleton. But sometimes it makes more sense to store certain things in other places than just to pile it in the garage. All right, so take that kind of approach to it. All right, now let's take this one step further, and instead of hard coding that value Mike, let's have the number from the first screen go in there. So we'll go into our core, and we already have the string name up there, but let's do static int number. Although I don't think we're forcing them to put a number in there, but we'll go ahead and pretend like it has to be a number. So that's going to be the number that they enter in our first text box. So now when we get to our second text box, or the button, we're going to go to our main activity here. So we have our input ET is a global variable here inside of main activity. So this guy has a global scope inside of main activity, not global to the entire application. So screen 2 does not have access to this guy, but everything inside of main activity does. So what I want to do here in the next page button is we're going to go ahead and we're going to set the core variable equal to whatever is in that, the integer version of whatever is in that, that code up there. Okay? So we're going to do this one way, and then I'll show you the problem with this. So we're going to say core.number is equal to this dot input et dot get text dot toString. So that's going to be a string, and I'm going to say integer dot parseInt of that string, so I get the actual number representation of that string. And I'll store that inside of core.number. All right. Now we're just going to do that for right now. We're storing it up there. We're not going to use it on the second screen because we only have a few minutes left. But we'll see it work once, then I'll go back, and then we'll see it crash. Okay, so then we'll add some logic to make sure that it doesn't crash. Under what circumstances would our application crash right now? If I put in a 5 here, I do next screen, we're fine. What if I put in an LOL here? If I do integer.parseInt on LOL, what happens? Not good things. If I put nothing up there, I leave it blank, also not good things. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we only want to launch that second screen and squeeze the number out of it if something is in there and it's a number. All right, so we're going to say if, let's just store it real quick. So we're going to say string val is equal to this dot input et dot get text dot toString. So now we have val. We're going to say if val dot length is greater than 0, then we know we have something in there. Okay, but now we want to know, does val hold a number? Okay, so one thing we can do without actually writing a function that checks to see if it's a number is we can try to do something that potentially has a problem. So I'm going to try to do a bunch of crap. Try to do all this stuff where I squeeze the number out of input et. And then if something bad happens, I will catch, in this case I'll just catch the generic exception e. And I'll do system.out.println e. I'll just do println e. That's good enough for right now. All right, so I'll do a quick check to make sure they put something in that box. If they didn't, I'm not going to even try to launch the next screen. We'll just hit the button over and over again. I won't even try to go there because we won't get inside of this if statement. All right, but what we're going to have here is when we try to get to that second screen now, we will try to get the number out of that string. If it works, great, we'll get there. Otherwise, we will have an exception get thrown. We'll catch that exception and print it out, but we'll never get to that second screen. So there's me entering that, not crashing. There's my LOL. Not crashing, but there's my 5. We're on the second screen. Okay? Now, homework for Thursday, and I'll put this up on Blackboard, is we're still working on that team soccer application, right? We want to create a screen for reading in a single player. All right? So go ahead and up in your singleton, you're going to create your array list of players, of player objects, and be able to add a player, and the player is going to have 2 pieces of information, right? Jersey number and skill. So you'll have an interface that's going to take in 2 pieces of information, 2 numbers, or yeah, well, 2 numbers are fine. You'll create a player object, you'll store that player object in your array list. We're not doing anything else with it. Just create that widget part of your application that can add a player to your array list. That make sense? All right, I will see everybody on Thursday. Don't forget, today is the student, faculty, staff Bible study at lunch. Just go down to the cafeteria, sign in, get free lunch, cod and grub, take it down to the terrace room.